BioCentury this week is brought to you by Jeito Capital, a leading global independent private equity fund with a patient benefit-driven approach aimed at financing and accelerating the development of groundbreaking medical innovation. Jeito's unique investment strategy combines significant capital and collective expertise to support biopharma companies and their management teams, ranging from clinical development to market access for cutting-edge innovations, with one main objective: go faster for the patient. Learn more at jeito.life.
Welcome to a special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and we are coming to you from beautiful Prague in the Czech Republic, where we are wrapping up the 26th edition of our Bioequity Europe conference. Joining me to discuss key takeaways from the event are Detlev Mennerich, Head of Boehringer Ingelheim Venture Fund, Mehdi Ainouche.
That's correct.
I spent 5 minutes practicing that this morning, so I wanted to make sure I got it right. Partner at Jeito Capital. And then from BioCentury, we have the venerable VP and Editor-in-Chief, Simone Fishburne, Steve Usden, Washington editor, and our head of BD, Josh Berlin.
I'm not venerable?
No.
It's kind of become a running joke. I come up with a different superlative to describe Simone.
His salary is tied to it, yes.
So you were esteemed, and then you were illustrious, then you were renowned, and now you're venerable. There was an alliteration that I like to play with there. So thank you to our sponsors again for a tremendous conference over the past few days. Before we start diving into the topics, just, been a beautiful weather this week. How's everyone enjoyed Prague? Have you guys gotten out? Have you seen some sights? Mehdi, Detlev, do you have a nice time here for a couple days?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, beautiful weather, kind of warm in the hotel rooms. I guess we all share that. And we'll probably come back to that, but leaving Paris with the plane and getting in, with the current M&A buying spree, and somehow, waiting for the news of the coming week, and not even barely leaving the plane and arriving at the airport in Prague, already seeing the Candid deal. And here we are at the last day of the edition, and another one announced this morning in ophthalmology. And I saw 2 hours ago, I think, a novel licensing deal from GSK. We'll have the time.
We will get to this. We will get to this.
Yeah,
the
weather is, let's say, sunny everywhere.
Very good. Right. Well, I think to kick things off, Simone, I'd like to start with you. I know you've spent days preparing this, so why don't you give me a couple of your major takeaways?
Okay, I just want to clarify, I haven't spent days preparing for the podcast, but I did spend days preparing for the scene setter analysis, which I'm going to go into in a minute. But I want to just say, there always is, every time, amazing energy and buzz at the conference. A lot of the value in this and other BioCentury conferences is in the hallway conversations. And I have to start off with a quote that I think kind of captures where we are today. And somebody said to me, and I'm not allowed to say who it was, but somebody said to me, if I had $1 for every time I heard China at this conference, I could fund our next round. So I thought that pretty much captured it. So before I get to China, in our scene setter analysis, this year we started actually from the premise that China has completely changed the conversation around the speed to clinical trials or to first-in-human data, and that is tied directly to valuations, to funding, to biotech success. And so what we looked at was clinical trials based on clinicaltrials.gov, focusing in particular on phase 1, from 2021 to 25, and looked at where Europe is in that landscape. And that was a very interesting and dynamic opening scene setter plenary session. So there are 2 or 3 sort of things that came out of the data and the conversations that I just wanted to highlight. One, it came out of our data, and it also came out of the McKinsey data, that Spain is really emerging as a new center within Europe, but even without Europe, outside of Europe. So clinical trials, real hotspot there in Spain, in particular in cancer, not just within Europe, but globally. they're rising in funding, and so there's definitely something going on there that we've, not only because BioEquity Europe was in Spain a couple of years ago, though I'm sure it's catalyzed by that.
There's a direct connection, yes. You're right.
The other thing is, looking locally, really Central Europe seems to be quite rich in I&I, immunology and inflammation trials, and there were a few reasons behind that came out in one of Steve Usden's panels that he might want to reflect on it in a few minutes. And then sort of at a higher level, I just want to talk about a current from there and through the other conversations, a current that goes via Steve, in as much as we're really at a pivotal moment. And there's a lot of changes in the US, both at a policy front, which means drug pricing, and at FDA. There's obviously this rise of China, huge talk about China. Mm-hmm. And in the hallway conversations and the other meetings I've had, there's really a sense actually that Europe is getting close to China, and it's good to spend some time outside of the US, because there really is a feeling among some of the Europeans that I've spoken to that the US might actually be missing out on what's actually the conversation here, which is that, maybe the US won't always be the only partner and place that Europe can go to, and that there are, opportunities. There's obviously concerns, but, China is certainly an alternative partner, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that conversation unfolds.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good opportunity now for us to, Detlev, I wanted to bring you in maybe to the conversation here, because we were talking a bit, and I think you had some thoughts on China and kind of that dynamic there. So maybe could you share a little bit on what some of your takeaways about that China perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yes, definitely. So we are on the ground in China. I was traveling 8 times since January last year to China. On upcoming Monday, we go to our IC to make 2 proposals for Chinese investments. So I don't see China as a threat. I see it as an opportunity also for Europe to find partners who have a common vision. And it's nothing against US or it's nothing against China. So we in Europe, we need to be self-assured, or saying there is great science, we need partnerships. They can be in the US, they can be in China, they can be anywhere in Australia, to bring concepts to prototypes, to first in-man, to clinical proof of concepts. And so China was not there, and Antoine said it in the opening lecture, they didn't appear out of nothing. They didn't come out of nowhere. There is a sustained plan, and what we see today, this is unfolding since 2-3 years with a huge deal making. This is not the end, so there are still gaps. They were closing it, and we in Europe and in US, so US is high on capital, maybe shifting a bit. Europe was high on science, but low on capital. But if we look back the last 10 years, also years in development, and China now brings everything together. The capital is there, the talents are there, and so the CMC costs and time efficiency is mind-blowing. Maybe they will close the gap in the next 5 years also from the first-in-class new therapeutic concepts. And then it's an ecosystem where we need to play and to find our way. We in Europe, so now coming to your question, maybe because of missing of larger funds, looking at you, Mehdi, because I'm representing a very small fund, a pharma corporate fund. So there's great science, great ideas, great concepts. Sometimes we sell our companies at proof of technology, but not where the main product is unfolding the value. And then it goes where the capital sits and the multinational companies are for global exploitation. Because at the end of the day, we are here also for making money, yes, but we are here to provide new solutions to patients. And these drugs will be exploited globally. So at the end, we all want the same. And China, Europe, US, you talked about the regulatory authorities changes. Maybe we park this for a moment. It's a complex context on its own, but I see a lot of opportunities.
Mm.
Absolutely, and if I thank you, Detlev, comment on that. This is back to the core, vision of our fund and raising so much of capital, because we believe that exactly as you say, you don't just identify great science, try to throw it however in the clinic, try to hunt for a signal. and then hope for somebody to acquire. You have to be more, let's say, bullish and put the means on the table, which means a lot more money to push to meaningful clinical data for what that means, meaning, well-powered phase 2b dose range finding, high pharma standard, being able to really get to either the next late stage development phase, or if there's the right partnering option, really being plug and play for those type of quality. Now, maybe back to the comment on China and Europe and our strength in Europe was that, as you rightly said, maybe the novelty of science, first-in-class opportunities are definitely a shot, which we have in Europe. However, during the conference, actually, I took a note from, one of the panelists rightly pointing out that there's been a shift there from even, the traditional small molecule biologics, which they are able to get full speed until the, phase 1 and then partner. By the way, we see more and more that they're keeping the jewels a little more, because same comment for the Chinese partners. They try to sell it later and try to unfold the value later. But the interesting part is that even for, let's say, pure novel or more complex, let's say, modalities, let's take siRNA, for example, complex chemistry, or even multi-specific next-gen biologics, long-acting, there's almost one deal popping up every week on those type of, next-gen. So I think they're good on the innovation piece and the next-gen type of modalities as well, which is kind of interesting. And back to the news today, GSK has been doing this deal with that siRNA company, so it proves out that they also have a shot. So it's good to be first in class, but then execution is key. And well, I guess we have our role in play here, Jeito, to finance through the next challenges in Europe.
Yeah, I wanted to, so obviously you mentioned, you guys raised over €1 billion in your fund to help really, supercharge, finance a lot of these growth companies as they get later. I found it interesting because we spent, a lot of the conference was talking about speed. How can we try and be as fast as China and that sort of thing? But there was a discussion this morning at one of the panels this morning where I think what was noted was the fact that one of Europe's maybe historical norms was capital efficiency and being very efficient with the output. And I think one of the arguments was that, well, if you want to try and increase the speed, you have to spend a lot more capital. And so you kind of lose some of that, maybe that historical capital efficiency. And so is that the right way to think about it? Should companies be asking for 25% more when they're raising because they're going to be saying, well, we need to try and catch up to China? Or how should companies be thinking about that?
I think there's the right middle, and sorry for the normal response, a little bit in the middle.
That's okay. It's a good dodge.
Yeah, I think we as investors have a practice which is to tranche deals, and so that enables us to commit a lot of money right away. But at the same time, you really put the big beans once you have unlocked a certain level of de-risking. So that enables to be cost efficient on one hand, and at the same time, whenever you try to, you reach those milestones, a true clinical signal in the clinic on one first patient population where the bar is low, you could have an accelerated path. Then we're here to deploy much more capital on a first program, full speed to the, patient, and at the same time deploy in different indications. And so I think there's the right pace, I would say, keeping the discipline of cost efficiency, which we do see here. And that's directly related to our investment strategy and the practice style.
I think to some degree, I don't want to say it's a canard, but, cost efficiency, first of all, it doesn't help you to be extremely cost efficient if it means you end up being 10th in class, right? So when you talk about the efficiency, it really depends on what are you shaving off, right? So if that money that you're actually spending is going to value driving data or value driving, whatever other forms of payment, that's not a question of efficient. That is part of what you need to spend the money on. I think the idea is, are you spending money on things you don't need to be spending on? What's the pace at which you spend money? And one of the things that I actually thought was very encouraging that came out in the Scene Setter deck, and Jeito is part of that, is the fact that Europe, well, two things. One is the fact that Europe has now got several billion-dollar plus funds for growth capital, and that's something that hasn't been here in the past, and it may take a few years for that to start changing the conversation around, we must have more growth capital, but there certainly seems to be more money in Europe for growth. And then the other part of that is seeing more and more European companies with the, say, 50 million plus kind of A rounds, even seed, early stage funding. So I think the tranching may still continue to some degree, but I really feel like the financing is bolder, let's say, than it was 5 to 10 years ago.
Absolutely. More ambitious. And, in that, let's say, trajectory, our capital is there to be spent on, pipelines, multiple programs, multiple patient populations, and TPPs to be tested in the clinic. And so that's part of the, acceleration of validation of the quality science we have in here to be tested not only in a single program, but to be deployed in many different possible directions, and optimizing the business case also for the potential future acquirer and not wasting time, doing things sequentially. So fully agree with that.
Yeah, wonderful. So I want to transition now because we had another, what at least I thought was one of the most highly anticipated fireside chats ever, probably, at least that I can recall from BioEquity. And so that was Steve. I want to turn to you, Steve Usden, who you were the moderator of that chat with Dr. Richard Pazdur.
Yeah, so it was really fascinating to talk with Dr. Richard Pazdur. I think, as everybody knows, he was, for a very short period of time, the director of the Center for...
How many days? Do we have it in days?
It was about 10 Scaramucci's.
I was going to say, do we measure it in Scaramucci's?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so he was the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Before that, he was the founding head of the Oncology Center of Excellence, and before that, he was the head of oncology at CDER at FDA, and really an icon, really somebody who has done more to shape the regulatory environment that's enabled advances in cancer, I think, over the last 2 decades than anyone. So, I came away from that discussion, kind of with 3 points, right? So one was, he said, people have short memories and they forget all the things that have happened over the last year, but he said that they left a lasting mark at FDA, so he went back about a year ago when there was a kind of traumatic purge, firing at random of FDA staff. And he said that has had echoes that have gone down till today. Look, we've had 5, I think, directors of CDER over the last year. In the past, that's a position that's open. Usually people had it for a decade or more, right? About 20% of FDA staff has left. Morale is in the toilet. And those things are ongoing challenges. He also had some interesting things to talk about, some of the kind of signature announcements that have come out of FDA recently. And he said basically that the press releases, the announcements that are coming out are unhinged from reality, from the steps that would need to be taken to implement them. That in the past, the process would have been to socialize things among FDA's career staff and then develop a plan and then go out and announce it. He said over the last year, it's really been the opposite. Things have been announced, FDA staff have learned about them from the press releases, and then scrambled to try how to figure them out. He gave one, for example, the most recent one was the real-time review program that's been announced. Right. And he had some cautions about that. And he said, the name of it is based on something that he had at the Office of Oncology, the Oncology Center of Excellence, which was intended to allow FDA staff to review the final results of trials, pivotal trials, when they've been finished, but before companies had actually submitted all the documentation to FDA. The way that it's being interpreted now, FDA staff are going to be getting access to clinical trial data as the trials are going on. And he said, you really want to think about that. Do you really want FDA reviewers who have never conducted a clinical trial looking at your data on an ongoing basis?
3 patients, 4 patients, 6 patients.
Well, there's this adverse event. Maybe we should blow the whistle, So
this is like me editing your story as you're writing.
As I'm writing, that's a terrifying. That's a terrifying idea. It's like you literally putting a chair behind my desk and just watching me type.
What was that comment? So the third thing that he talked about, which was really fascinating to me. So he's been out of FDA for a while now. So we kind of talked about what does it look like from the outside looking in. And one of the things he said, which I think is not a surprise to most people who have been in drug development, is a real concern about a lack of consistency at FDA. And he's seeing that even more when he's on the outside. He says that there's a real need for more external engagement. FDA has throttled back its use of advisory committees and other forms for getting external engagement. And he talked about possibilities and real potential for clinical trial innovation and regulatory innovation that he sees going forward.
So, Steve, I'm going to ask you a question. Some of the other panelists may weigh in as well. But one of the things that I've been hearing is this idea, look, everything is bad there. You know, we keep getting this drumbeat of negative signals. FDA is not the only place we can go, right? And there's, you know, different regulators we can go to, different places we can run our trials. What do you think? You think the U.S. is still so big? Ultimately, you need to get your drug approved there. How should people think about that?
I think it's possible to over-index on the difficulties and the challenges, because the fact is that drugs still are getting reviewed, things still are getting through. It's just that there's been more of an element of inconsistency, of kind of randomness. There's some areas that are kind of like no-go areas, obviously vaccines, mRNA, things like that. But it's not like nothing is getting through there or everything is bad. It's more that it's just gotten to be a lot more challenging and unpredictable. And I think that it's still the reality that the U.S. market is far and away the most important. And I don't think that anybody's seriously going to say, oh, well, we can have a viable ecosystem that kind of goes around the United States. It's still the center of everything, or of a lot of things.
Detlev, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I agree. So, Steve, we had a pre-discussion about this. So, disclaimer, by far, I'm not a regulatory expert, but I have a view on things, and I see so the FDA is and was and remain the gold standard for any regulatory advice and getting approval. But certainly in the phase one, let me say from first in man to first clinical proof of concept, there is a new market, and there, I wouldn't say a new standard, but there are other marketplaces where we can be very fast and cost efficient to get to the point. When it goes into a pivotal trial, and the first confirmatory trial in oncology, for example, for sure every biotech, big pharma will and remain staying in the US, because with the MFN, there's a new reality now, I would say, because the launch sequence will drive the clinical strategy already now, and this will and remain in the US FDA regulated. But the early piece, what we actually see in partially very little in Europe, but in Australia and China, there's a new normal, and this is outside of the US, it's without the FDA. They're reacting on it now, they made the announcement, they want to change, but from the announcement until the operational execution on it, they need another 9 months, a year now. That's a prediction.
Well, yeah, most of the announcements that have been made in the United States from FDA and from the administration trying to, because they recognize the issue, and they're trying to streamline access to first-in-human trials. They're trying to create incentives for companies to do trials in the United States. But I haven't heard of anything that's actually going to move the needle on that very much. It may be that we see first-in-human trials being launched in some fashion in the United States to kind of like have your toe in the water there, so you can get some kind of incentive for doing it there, but really doing it somewhere else. But I don't think there's anything that's going to change the dynamics that we've been talking about this meeting for the last 2 days.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Steve. So we're going to take a short break, and we will be right back.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the third BioCentury Grand Rounds in Seattle. Advancing drug development requires more than discovery. It requires the right partners. The third edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds US convenes venture capital, biopharma decision makers, and academic innovators in Seattle, June 3rd to 5th. This R&D-focused forum brings together leaders at the forefront of translational science to examine the breakthroughs, bottlenecks, and strategies shaping the future of drug and diagnostic development, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Discover cutting-edge disease biology and platform technologies. Gain insights from emerging biotechs and academic pioneers. Schedule partnering meetings with VCs, pharma, and leading academics who can accelerate your path forward. Grand Rounds US is where rigorous science meets strategic capital, and where the right conversations move discovery toward development. Join us in Seattle and discover what's next in biopharma and who's driving it. Secure your spot. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
Welcome back to a special episode of the BioCentury This Week podcast, as we're live from this year's BioEquity Europe conference in Prague. So for our live podcast, we have started a bit of a tradition, which thankfully Steve has remembered to do this time, which was fantastic. So we encourage our guests to wear some colorful or extravagant socks for the show so our audience can see them. But for the podcast listeners, I'm going to kind of go around and see what we've got. Let's see, Steve, you want to start us off? What do you...
I actually got them here. So these are socks that say Prague. They should have said Praha. I don't know why they say Prague. Anyway, they say Prague, but they also have dachshunds. So I have the dachshund socks. A little bit of personal information. I do have 2 dachshunds waiting for me.
Oh, that's a good explanation. Wonderful. Mehdi, what do you got? You said you had a little special surprise for us. What do you got?
It looks sober like this, so perfect for a suit, for a conference.
Right.
But then if you closely look, there's the Daddy Cool sign here, not only because I love disco, but also because I also have a personal story there. I'm just a young daddy, that's it.
Okay, very good, very good. Simone?
Well, I'm flying the BioCentury flag with BioCentury This Week socks.
I think that's 2 live pods in a row where you've worn the same socks, which
I didn't know we were doing this.
a little bit lazy. That's okay.
Okay.
That's fine. Josh, did you make an effort?
Yeah, I'm trying to get as much ROI out of our sock budget as possible, so I went the same way.
It's very on
That's
brand.
capital efficiency.
That's right.
That's very good for you. I've got... I was going to do what you did. I was going to buy some socks when I got here, but I did not find a place to buy them. And so my fallback was I've got some socks with T-Rexes on them, which are my youngest son's favorite dinosaurs. So I just figured I'd rock the T-Rexes. Detlev, do I need to put you on the spot here?
Yeah, I got some socks from my son. They were colorful, but I forgot to put them on this morning. So now I have simply boring dark
got the
blue.
blue socks.
What would they have been if you
Hey,
had
tell us
put
what they
them
would
on?
have been had you remembered.
With some leaves, wheat on it.
Weed.
Wheat. Yeah.
Wheat.
Oh, wheat, not
wheat.
wheat, not wheat.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. All right. Just,
Next time I'll do
we got to
weed.
clarify that. Okay. Good. Excellent. All right. Well, let's get back into our discussion, kind of recapping what, I think it's been a wonderful couple of days of conversations here in Prague. Mehdi, I wanted to turn to you. You already kind of previewed for us what you would like to talk about earlier, but I think you had some ideas about, what your expectations are for M&A. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so actually, and by the way, that comes from reception discussion with a banker who I will not personally quote, but gave some truly interesting insights about, the 2026, M&A trends. And, we've seen what's been going on since, almost a year now. I think year to year, if we take Q1 25 to now, if you compare just in terms of total deal value, this has almost doubled or nearing it. And taking a step back and looking at the big picture, if you try to explain a little bit what's happening, so we all are very well aware of, the loss of revenues, the 2035 horizon. So we're talking about the famous $350 billion loss of revenues. And if you took just a different angle of view, and that's what I got, which was really interesting, is a 5-year horizon between now to 2031. Actually, you have some of the main pharma concerned, if they want to go for the very usual 4% compounded annual growth rate that they want to communicate on, they need to take over $69 billion accumulated sales by then.
Of new revenue.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's interesting because, and that's what I got from this banker, is that if you closely look at taking the listed companies, because they're at this stage of maturity, very close from the market, there are a number of very identified companies that can actually fill this gap. It looks like there's an imbalance between supply and demand, because actually we're talking about 28 identified listed players that could fill up the gap. Interestingly, out of those 28, so we're talking about the Argenics, Syndis Pharma of this world, profitable companies, and it can go down to 2 billion type of early revenues, which is already quite good, right? Cytokinetics as well, type of players. Talking about those 28, 10 have already been acquired in the last 2 years, which means, from now, retrospectively in two years before. The last one was Apellis, acquired by Biogen.
Right.
So it looks like there's another 18 left. Let's see what's going to be, the next big move. But that was an interesting part of the play. Now, we all see that things are getting more competitive. So pharma are definitely acquisitive. Despite all of these acquisitions, all of these numbers, you still see that
There's a strong dry powder, almost $1 trillion out there. It's getting more competitive. Now you have mid-sized pharma that are super active. Big biotech, Genmab is in the play. Argenx could, when you look at the amount of cash that they have. So let's see. By the way, some of these folks are both targets for big acquirers as well as acquirers themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what's been really interesting to see is that you've got this whole new class of acquirers. We saw Genmab become an acquirer itself. And so we know that also the number of biotechs taking products to market themselves is growing. So how do you think that plays out? Do you think that that just becomes a permanent part of the ecosystem? Or do you think those sort of what we call biotech acquirers or big biotech acquirers will themselves just get swallowed up?
So interesting. Let's see what the future reserves. But all I can say is that for, especially in Europe, and for talking about our perspective at Jeito and our portfolio companies, it just opens a new set of opportunities and optionality for BD partnering discussions with the different players. And it must be almost a reflex, not to put away any phenotype of acquirer. And you must not forget those, let's say, new players out there that have appetite, that are coming to the market, who you can speak with. Obviously, each one has its own constraints. For example, we know that pharma can go big in terms of check size, can go fast, and can put 80 people in the data room to review all the data and put an offer on the table within days. But I had an interesting discussion with, here again, I won't quote, but a global head of mid-size BD pharma, who told me that one of their latest billion-dollar acquisition, they were able finally to change their habits and move within 3 weeks and ultimately win the bid. And that to me is new, and I learned it right here. So, it seems like it's a new type of dynamic area. It's super exciting.
I wanted to get you guys' perspective on one of those deals that we saw this year, which was the Organon takeout, in particular because, as Simone just mentioned, they were one of these companies that had sort of grown into being a acquirer, and we kind of had started to view them as an aggregator of women's health assets. And with them being taken out, I think we talked about this internally at the time, like, is this a good thing for women's health? Is this a bad thing for women's health products, like in the advancements there? Do you have a perspective on that and where that might be going?
So you could look at things in the two different angles and the half empty, half full glass. I'd say that when I saw the news myself, well, it was quite known that Organon was probably looking at different sort of optionality. So now, let's say, being backed, or as you say, swallowed by a different player, you could think of, okay, there's a more solid player now for women's health acquisition, which honestly is, I think, going in the direction, but the good direction. But we're still having this very identified, I don't want to say small number, but very identified number of acquirers in the women's health space. Nevertheless, Lilly is in the game. They've been announcing,
big.
Yeah, their chief scientific officer is in. They have an internal task force now. We, Jeito, have our own play from an investor perspective. We've been scouting assets, scouting teams. By the way, that's the first asset we're looking for, is to build around teams. And we have a clinical stage company called Ropronovo, which is addressing fertility, endometriosis, adenomyosis, embryo implantation. And we know that the key take home here is probably that for women's health partnering, you're going to have to push it to commercial stage to be, a plug-and-play franchise for potential acquirers.
Glad hearing this. So if I talk about what do I see and inhale, get inspired here, I think our industry was not able to deliver on women's health, and we were not able to delivering on neurodegeneration. And being here in Prague these days, I see early ideas, concepts, which are outside of the established pathways in neurodegeneration, also women's health, endometriosis, osteoporosis. And this really inspires me, because if we look what is the next wave, because the science, the data first, then we can talk about M&A, the data are driving this. If I look, I think you had it in one of the other podcasts, there is a silent revolution. SI and ASO was approved in niche indications, established modality. But there will be in the next 6-7 months 5 major phase 3 readouts for acquired diseases, LPA, PCSK9, Huntington. This will establish a completely new modality. Also in the context of China, if you go to Zhou, they are only on one campus. There are more than 24 of SI companies, different chemistry, different approaches. So this is inspiring. So the science, and also there's a not perhaps a silent shift, but it's a seismic shift, I would even say. All the deals, also you were reporting on the in vivo CAR T for autoimmunity as well as in cancer. This will change the CAR T pioneering work, establishing this as a modality into a completely new heights. And this is not working on symptoms. It's a B-cell repertoire reset. First time we can talk about curation of autoimmune diseases. This is a revolution of our industry where we should be proud of. So here, so many companies, I thought I know everything. No, by far not. Really great ideas, concepts. This is inspiring me.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's a really good review. And Josh, I'm sorry to have left you for so long, but in actual, I thought I was going to try and do you a bit of a favor because you've been pretty much emceeing every panel or thing for the last 2 days, that your voice was maybe getting a bit hoarse. And so I was going to give you a break before I brought you in. So I hope you've recovered that for now. But can you give me a few, takeaways, maybe just from like the regional kind of like vibe perspective on how it's gone this week?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So, a lot of energy this week, but I think also a lot of recognition and discussion that essentially innovation can happen anywhere. A lot of discussion, obviously, about China. BioCentury's been going out to China for a long time now. And when we first started going out 13, 14 years ago, there weren't a whole lot of people that, at least in the West, that really believed there was a lot of innovation going on in China, or that there would ever be a lot of innovation going on in China. There's discussion about the Organon buyout. I mean, Sun Pharma, I was at a U.S.-Indian conference last week in Boston when that news broke, and it was the talk of the room about Sun Pharma becoming a global player, essentially, via this deal. And here, in Prague, where, there's been so much energy, and we've had just a great regional host, a committee chaired by Prague Bio, IOCB Tech, and a few others. And we had the good fortune on Sunday night to get invited to a local play that was put on by, the play was one that had been launched a while ago, but it was put on, special edition was put on for a few of the guests in town for bioequity, and was called The Elegance of the Molecule. And I'm based in the US. I certainly think I know a lot about Gilead, think I know a lot about HIV medications, and in fact, I had forgotten that the story of Gilead really, in many parts, started here in Prague with some molecules that were, licensed in by Gilead, by John Martin, who was head of R&D at Gilead. He had first started looking at the molecules when he was at Bristol. And I think to me, it was very inspiring to hear how, a professor, Holly here, was able to develop something, discover something that, became one of the most important drugs really over the last 30 years, right? I mean, look at all the folks that have been impacted by, that had HIV, Hep B as well. To me, that was really inspiring, and so really wanted to thank our regional host for that, and I think it's something that BioCentury really believes in, and hopefully we'll continue to see innovation coming from places not only where we expect, but also where we don't expect.
I just want to second that, and I would say if people get the opportunity to see the play, The Elegance of the Molecule, it's really worth it. I think a lot of people in the US, especially this gen, don't necessarily know the foundational story of it, and John Martin's incredible contribution there.
Well said. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Well, we have 33 seconds left, but I need to kind of get this going, and I don't think there's enough time. I had a trivia question that I'd drawn up.
Okay, come on, let's do it. We can go over.
It's a bit, well, but without the context, it's not.
What's the context?
So the context. This was meant to come up in our insiders panel yesterday, but someone we didn't get around to that topic. I won't name names, but what I wanted to discuss was sort of this growing sense, at least in the conversations I've had with people about Europe and its sense of needing to try and be more self-reliant in some ways, not every way, but in some ways, in terms, and I think a lot of that was coming out of this idea of, can Europe provide more capital to its own companies? So rather than VCs raising billion-pound, billion-euro funds, where the vast majority of that LP capital is coming from outside of Europe, can you have those funds being majority funded by insurance providers, pension funds, these sorts of things. So that was context of some of these conversations I've been having.
I was sure this was going to be about the Eurovision Song Contest.
It's not, I promise. But it just got me thinking.
ABBA was here.
Then, so what flows out of that is so that, like, are there other ways that Europe can become more self-reliant, and that gets into like capital markets? And I'm not going to have that discussion about whether we need to build a NASDAQ in Europe yet. But it did make me wonder, when was the last, like, looking back 10 years, and this comes to the trivia question. Don't look at the answers. In the last 10 years, how many European biotechs, and I'm using biotech very loosely here, how many European biotechs raised more than 100 million in an IPO on a European exchange? So 10 years, going back to the beginning of 2016, I believe. I'm going to give each of you a guess. You want to guess first?
At the IPO or follow-on?
At the IPO.
At the IPO?
Yep.
Wow.
From Euronext.
From any EU exchange.
I think we should poll the audience.
Well, let's get some answers.
Any idea?
Eric's saying one.
Wow. Okay.
Dave, Karen?
Sounds like an auction. We get two from anyone.
No raises on the one.
Okay.
I literally started my career 10 years ago, so I should, have the visibility.
Remember, I said very loosely. I said loose definition of biotech. So
I would be in a line one or two. Yeah.
Steve, you got any guess?
Since it's coming from you, I would guess the answer is 0. That's probably a trick question.
Well, this is going to end on a very positive note then, because it's not. It's actually, the answer is actually 3.
I'm going to say 3.
But again, I'm going to
It
go.
It doesn't count if you say it now.
So it was Galderma quite recently, which you can debate whether that was really a biotech IPO. That's why I said loosely. One was Nightingale, which was a healthcare services company in London, which I was not familiar with to begin with. And then Polyfor, which was a Swiss anti-infectives back in, I think, 2017, 2018.
Cycles, yeah.
Point being, there were 3, so more than you guys thought, but then there were 27 European biotechs that did IPOs on NASDAQ during that same period and raised more than 100 million. So still quite a bit of dependency there from Europe.
All right. Well, next time let's do the Eurovision Song Contest.
All right, next time we can dig more into
that one.
But for the time being, we now are over time, so I think we should wrap it up. So thank you to our audience for joining us for this special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We will catch you next week wherever you get your podcasts, or if for the audience, if you want to come join us live again. Next month, we are at Grand Rounds Conference in Seattle. We are then at our Grand Rounds Europe Conference in Amsterdam in September. And then next year, we will be in Copenhagen for our BioEquity 2027.
Absolutely. Copenhagen, we're looking forward to it. Josh, any last words about Copenhagen?
Yeah, just a lot of energy already. We've already opened up early bird or super early bird registration, and we hope you'll all come out in May 2027 and have a great regional host committee.
Who are the regional hosts, Josh? Just remind me. I've forgotten.
Cue me up.
Who are those regional hosts, Josh?
Let me tell you, Stephen.
Thank
you. Chaired by Novo Holdings and Lundbeck Funden and quite a few others in the ecosystem there. So we hope all of you will come back for our 27th BioEquity, and we look forward to seeing you in May 2027.
I think what we should do is start inviting people to send in their requests for the trivia question of the podcast next year.
Okay, all right, let's do it. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
BioCentury would like to thank Jeito Capital for its continued support of our BioCentury This Week podcast and our 26th annual BioEquity Europe Conference this May in Prague, Czech Republic.